Okay, this podcast will look at the effect of the First World War on Russia. Russia joined in August 1914, to much fanfare and patriotic fervour. The Tsar was more popular than ever, and the Russians went off to fight against the Austrians and the Germans. And to begin with, they had some notable successes on a small scale, but very quickly it became apparent that the Russian army was no match for the modern German army in particular. And two very important battles that you need to remember for your exam: Tannenberg and Masurian Lakes. By the end of 1914, moving into early 1915, huge defeats in East Prussia, which is Eastern Europe, East Prussia. Well, for example, let's look at Tannenberg. Of the 130,000 soldiers that went into battle there, 30,000 were killed and over 90,000 were captured. I mean, that is a staggering disaster for the Russians. Apparently it took 6 trainloads to transport all the captured men and material back to Germany. And throughout the war, I think close to 15 million Russians are called up to fight. Well over 2 million are killed. I've got the statistics here. 2 million killed, 4 million wounded, and 2.5 million prisoners. I mean, that is a staggering disaster for the Russians. It's not helped that it doesn't help the Tsar that by the summer of 1915 he appoints himself as commander-in-chief of the Russian forces. What does that mean? Well, firstly, any defeat on the battlefield will be personally attributed to him. And secondly, he leaves his wife Alexandria at home to deputise for him in Petrograd, which is the new name for the capital after St. Petersburg, because St. Petersburg was felt to be too Germanic in its naming. Petrograd was the ethnic Russian city name for that place. So, the war starts badly and gets worse. A lot of these soldiers that went off to fight were conscripted. That means they were forced by law to go and fight. Their equipment was substandard, and there are anecdotes of which you can use that soldiers were using the weaponry of the dead soldiers in front of them on the battlefield to go off and fight. What it also means for the economy of Russia is that millions of farmers that had been called up to go and fight, and therefore all that expertise were now leaving the countryside in droves. Food production drops off. Factories that were producing fertilizers were now producing ammunition and gunpowder and explosives, which means that the crops won't yield as much in the summer months. Millions of trained factory workers, just like the farmers in the countryside, were called up to fight, so therefore the people manning the factories were not as highly trained. Production drops. What we see is greater migration into the cities to look for food, so the population of the cities grow by about 6 million during the First World War, and if they're not working, or if they're not working at a substandard level, therefore the demand for food in particular, but also fuel, rises, and the net result of that is inflation. If you talk about inflation in your exam, the bottom line is that the price for goods goes up, and especially the price of bread. Food shortages become a massive issue in the big cities, in particular Petrograd, by 1916, and crime rates rise. What we see is that the Okhrana by 1916 is struggling, this is the secret police, to keep control of the population. And the feeling on the street is that the Tsar is very unpopular, and the Tsarina, working in cahoots with Rasputin, were Russian spies, and that secretly they were in fact lovers. And again, the cartoonists get to play on that. And there we have it. There's the bottom line, the impact of the war. Disastrous. The next podcast is going to look at the events leading up to the February Revolution. But if you can talk about the longer term causes of the First World War on the Russian people and the Tsar in particular, you wouldn't go far wrong. Okay, so the next podcast will be about the February Revolution.